Fantastic. Well, welcome to the very first event in a series of purpose events that we're holding in 2022. It's great to see so many of you here representing a broad range of brands from all different sectors together on a journey to do something good. This event is all about radical transparency because the phrase is being used everywhere. But what does it mean? How do you use it? What are the implications? And that's precisely what we hope to be exploring this afternoon. I'm Nilesha Chauvet. I'm the Managing Director of Good, and I'm your host and your moderator for this event. I'm joined by two fantastic panelists offering their voices today. Firstly, I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Alex Edmonds, who is Professor of Finance at London Business School. So a very warm welcome, Alex. Thanks for taking the time out.
Thanks, Nilesha. Great to be here.
Thank you. He's the author of a seminal piece of work on purpose, the book called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, and it's definitely worth a read, available in all good bookstores. So a very warm welcome to you, Alex. I'm also joined by Pete Grant, who is our planning director. So hello, Pete.
Hi, everyone.
He manages the planning department at Good and oversees much of our proprietary thinking, and he'll be presenting a little bit later on. So in terms of our agenda, why this event, why now? I'll be setting the purpose landscape so that we will be setting the scene for radical transparency. I'm then going to hand over to Alex, who's going to make the case very passionately about why purpose is absolutely fundamental now, more than ever before, in fact. And then Pete Grant, who is going to explore some purpose themes and then the practical applications of radical transparency and what that really means day to day. And we will also open up the floor to you in the audience. If you have any questions, then do feel free to post them in the chat. Before we get into it, I'm going to do a really quick bit of housekeeping, which is message the Good Agency username if you're experiencing any technical difficulties. We do have people on standby. We are recording this session and we will make it available to anyone who wants a copy. You just need to email us at hello@goodagency.co.uk if you would like a copy. Any comments and questions, as I said, please pop them in the chat. I'm going to be checking it throughout the event. I can't promise to get through all of them, but I'm going to do my very, very best. But firstly, allow us to introduce ourselves. We are the Good Agency. We're a strategy and creative agency, and we're all about working for the world. And we were set up 27 years ago to help charities, not-for-profits, and commercial brands demonstrate their good. We've clients from both the charity and the commercial sector, so we're not only close to the issues and the values of the general public in market, but also we're very close to the economic and the business conversation that prevails globally in purpose, in marketing and communications. Purpose has been our focus and preoccupation for over 2.5 decades. But I think it's fair to say that we've never seen, at least in our time, a landscape that has changed quite so dramatically, nor a greater need for truth and transparency as we have now. So let's begin firstly to explore the landscape in more detail in terms of where we are right now. So if we move to the landscape scene, I think we can all agree that the world is changing faster than we are. We're trying to make sense of so many things going on at the moment: war, climate change, extremism, inequality, racism, diversity, and inclusion. The list seems to be endless. And we're still grappling with the seismic economic and cultural shifts brought on by the global pandemic. And many of us are left breathless, myself included, by the acceleration of tech and digital. And given those changes, it's clear that what was once a debate around purpose is now over. Purpose is now a given. And the stats do demonstrate this, and they are ever the more staggering when you look at the figures, with 7 in 10 suggesting that it's not enough for a brand to just make profit anymore. They need to demonstrate their impact. Purpose is seen as a growth accelerator. People want to work for a company that stands for something over and above just itself, that is making a meaningful change in the world. And a really good proof point of this is language and the way that language is evolving. Increasingly, the language around purpose is now much more consistent in its use than ever before and more frequent in its use. So this is a chart which really illustrates Google Ngram's detection of printed frequency of use for certain terms like, for example, socially responsible investing or impact investing. And we can see that the momentum has been gathering for some time and really skyrocketing post 2015 onwards. But the truth is there is a tension in the landscape. And that tension is that most companies are not transforming fast enough. We're not shifting the dial or having a big enough impact on many of the issues facing our world. So, for example, the net zero pledges of the top brands are not going to be met, despite good intention and promises made. It's more realistic that we'll see perhaps a 40% carbon cut, not net zero, which incidentally still falls short, right? Because what we really need to see is net positive and a proactive stance by brands driving to make a real difference, net zero being a given. In the UK, for example, the gender pay gap, depressingly, is getting a little bit worse rather than better. And also in the UK, we've sent double the amount of plastic to Turkey between 2020 and 21 for incineration. So there is a big gap between ambition and reality on the ground, which in some senses you could say is to be expected, because these issues are really big issues and they take time to solve. And for sure, there is no shortage of good intention. But unfortunately, over and above the fact that it's really hard and it's really complicated, and it's certainly not easy being a brand like many of you guys, genuinely tackling these issues in a call-out culture, where we've got the Twitterati ready to call you out. The truth is that we do have some bad actors on stage who are deliberately trying to distort the conversation, and that is the truth. That is also the reality we must face, I think. So one obvious example is BP, who hired Ogilvy to create a distraction campaign to promote the message that climate change is not the fault of the oil gas giant or the industry at large, but is the fault of individuals themselves. And in the process, popularized the term carbon footprint. And that term became so popular, you could say that their campaign was highly successful. Another example is M&M, who have been accused of creating a campaign promoting more inclusive characters in their chocolate to promote and distract from the bigger issue of a child slavery lawsuit. And probably the best known example is Coca-Cola with its 100 billion bottle problem, well documented in BBC Panorama for not doing enough to address the real problem of plastic bottle collection, and generally not doing enough to clear up the mess that they've been accused of creating in the first place. Now, we cite those examples not to throw stones, but to make the point that we understand that no brand is perfect. There are some bad actors, but many, many brands are trying to do the right thing. And like humans, we all make mistakes, right? And for sure, no brand is perfect. And any brand that is genuinely committed to doing good should be supported and applauded. But the truth is, there is no such thing as an honest cover-up. So on the one hand, we've got impossibly high expectations on brands to deliver positive impact. On the other, we've got the reality on the ground, which is that it's difficult to meet those expectations and it will take time. These are really big problems that we're dealing with. So we believe that the only legitimate way forward to help us navigate this tension and this conundrum is radical transparency. And it's a phrase that is being used so much in the landscape, particularly, I would say, in the last 6 months. And this year, it's really skyrocketed. So our definition, which I think is really helpful to share, of radical transparency, is all about acknowledging your challenges and opening up your commitments and progress to scrutiny, because it's very likely that if you don't, others will. And it's not just consumers venting on Twitter. For example, in the FT today, you can read about the European Central Bank threatening to reveal which banks are not meeting their climate commitments, which is a real example of radical transparency being forced upon brands. So radical transparency is all about being brave. It really does call for bravery. It calls for a much more proactive, not a reactive stance, one that is not simply an apology, given with obvious lack of foresight. It exists between claim and demonstration of your purpose and your commitment, and it should be a part of your culture, we think, giving you the confidence to act and therefore instilling confidence in all of your stakeholders. But before we move on, now more than ever, we believe that purpose is absolutely fundamental, and that hasn't changed, right? So we've been saying it for 2.5 decades. If anything now, purpose is more important. So I'm going to hand over to Professor Alex Edmonds now, who makes that passionate business case for purpose far better than I. And then we'll move on to Pete to talk to you about how you actually apply the principles of radical transparency in your everyday work. So I'm going to hand over to Alex now.
Great. Well, thank you very much once again, Nilesha, for the invitation. It's really great to speak to so many people committed on to purpose about a topic that I'm really passionate about. What I'm going to speak about is the business case for purpose. So there is certainly a moral and ethical case, and the moral and ethical case is really important. But unless there's a clear business and financial case, then I think purpose will always be second order in the minds of many CEOs. So I come to this as a professor of finance, not of business ethics or philosophy. Finance is often the enemy of purpose. Yet me, despite me being a lifelong finance person, I was an investment banker before I went into academia, I am somebody who can be so positive about purpose because of the strong business case. So I'm going to talk about that for 15 minutes, and importantly, how does it link to the radical transparency theme of the day? And so what I'm going to start with is actually by talking about a quite different view of purpose to what we typically think about. So my view of purpose is the following, and it's going to be illustrated with an example or a case study. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey away from your home offices to halfway around the world. So I'm going to take you to the Great Rift Valley. This stretches across 2 continents and 6,000 kilometers from Lebanon in Asia to Mozambique in Africa. And it has one of the world's highest mountains like this one, but also one of the world's deepest lakes. And this is a lake called Lake Magadi, where fewer than 1,000 people live. Now, one gentleman who lives here is a gentleman called Emmanuel Soronga, and he makes a living selling and herding goats. Now, for Emmanuel, it used to be that cash was king. So when he sold a goat, he'd receive cash, but he'd then have to check the cash because it might be forged. He'd store the cash and worry about it being stolen. And then to bank that cash, he had to walk for an entire day to the nearest bank. So his life was really tough. He couldn't graze his goats where he wanted to. He always had to be within one day of a bank. But all of that changed due to a purposeful business. And this purposeful business was Vodafone. So Vodafone launched in 2007 M-Pesa, a mobile money service, which allowed Kenyan citizens to transfer money from each other using their phone. So they did not need to rely on cash anymore. There was no problem with forgery or robbery. They could just transfer money on their phones. And this completely transformed Emmanuel's life. He didn't need to worry about cash. He could graze his goats when he wants to. But we don't want to make this about just one person. We want to look at large-scale evidence, which is my role as a business school professor. And indeed, there was a study which found that in the first 7 years of launching M-Pesa, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty because they now had access to finance. And in terms of the really important equality question that Nilesha highlighted, many of these households were headed up by women because it allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail. So there was a big positive effect on gender parity. So that's one story I'm going to tell you about Vodafone. But I'm now going to tell you a quite different story. And this different story is one of radical transparency. So in 2012, Vodafone became the first telecoms company around the world to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they're paying to governments worldwide. Now, obviously, tax is a key social role of a company to make sure that you're contributing to public finances. And within telecoms, this is a particular problem because you could choose to locate your intellectual property in low tax jurisdictions. So why am I starting my talk with these 2 examples? It's because I'd like you to think about these 2 questions. So the first is, which of these decisions, M-Pesa or tax transparency, created most value for society? And the second is, which of these decisions, if it had not been taken, would have led to the most public outrage, would have suffered from the call-out culture that Nilesha referred to, and worsened your reputation? I'm not going to poll anybody because most people agree with the answer. So which decision created most value for society? It was the first one. Right, M-Pesa lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and also contributed to gender parity. There was a huge social impact of providing access to finance. But if I think about the second question, what would have been the call out for Vodafone if they had not launched M-Pesa? Nothing. Right? They would not have been slammed by the media for not launching M-Pesa. Nobody would have thought it was even possible to do this crazy idea of banking without a bank. There would not have been a customer boycott or any article in the tabloids. Why? Because this is something that they would have never expected. But what is the call out if you are not transparent on tax? It could be massive. And indeed, Vodafone had suffered a nationwide boycott of their stores because of concerns that they had underpaid their tax. So why am I using this to talk about the importance of purpose? It's because I'd like to change our view on purpose to say it's not just about the second question, but it's also partly about the first. Now, don't get me wrong, right? That second question is absolutely important, right? Purposeful businesses should not do harm. They should not cheat on taxes. They should not pollute the environment. They should not mistreat their workers. And you should always be radically transparent about all the harm that you're doing. Like, what is the gender pay gap? What is the amount of taxes you're paying? What are your carbon emissions? But you probably knew that before coming on this webinar. You didn't need to give up an hour of your time to listen to us to know that you need to be radically transparent about the harm that you create. What I'm saying is that it's not enough for a company to think about not doing harm. It needs to actively do good and actively address these problems that Nilesha referred to earlier: climate change, automation, equality, diversity. Even if addressing those problems doesn't help you in terms of stopping a call out, because there would have never been a call out, I think the responsibility of a company is to get on the front foot on these issues. I really like the proactive, not reactive thing that Nilesha said at the end, and to think about how can we serve society and how can then we report on that, so that we move from this call-out culture of highlighting what bad companies do to what good companies do in terms of actually addressing those problems. And why? Well, first, there's the moral and ethical case, which is, I think that given the challenges the world faces, it is just ethical and responsible for a company to try and address them. But remember, I started by saying I'm going to look at this from a boring finance perspective. There is a business and financial case as well. And so what is the business and financial case of thinking about purpose as actively doing good, not just doing no harm? I'm going to introduce the framework I develop in the book that Nilesha kindly referred to. So we often think that the value the company creates is given by a pie, and that pie can be divided between profits to investors and value to stakeholders. The orange you could think about being taxes to the government, fair wages to workers and all workers, and also fair prices to customers. And obviously part of purpose is about splitting the pie fair. Like, we need to pay fair wages and fair taxes and fair prices, and we need to be radically transparent on what we're doing here. But I'm saying it's not enough for a company to do that. Why? Well, partly the business case for this is, if indeed we think about purpose as just splitting the pie this way, then it makes the company less profitable. And therefore, any CEO might think, well, purpose is something I shouldn't really put into practice because I actually just sacrifice profits by doing that. We indeed saw 2.5 years ago, many CEOs in the US signed the Business Roundtable statement claiming we're going to serve society in all of these ways. But when the rubber hit the road, many of them did not put it into practice. And indeed, if purpose involves making your company less profitable, then companies will only focus on the purpose dimensions that they can report, maybe employment statistics, gender pay gap, and so forth. Those are important things, but there's many other things that you can't report. How can I report? Am I genuinely having an inclusive corporate culture where people can speak up, people have meaningful work and skills development, those internal things, it's quite difficult to be transparent about because you can't really measure it. And so if companies always think about purpose as being costly, as reducing their profits, then they will only focus on the most visible issues, and they will ignore the potential to create value like M-Pesa or these hidden issues like corporate culture. So what I view purpose as is the idea of growing the pie. Absolutely, a company needs to increase the orange. They need to create value for society. But the way they do that is not just by redistributing value that's already been created, giving some profits to charity or so forth, but trying to create more value. And importantly here, the pie is social value. When I talk about growing the pie, I'm not talking about making more money. I'm not a trickle-down economist. I'm talking about how can we use the expertise that a company has to address the challenges of this world. And why is this something which has a business case? It's because even if you are motivated by social value, ultimately, something that creates social value ends up being something that you can monetize. So going back to Vodafone's launch of M-Pesa, it genuinely launched M-Pesa to solve a social problem, not because they thought they could make money. But after the fact, after they were able to make it work, then they found a way to monetize it, and therefore investors benefited as well. And why is that so powerful? Well, what do finance professors like me stress when they ask you to make a corporate decision? They say you should calculate the impact of a decision on profits. For example, if I'm considering an electric car factory, I can estimate how many cars will I make, how much I can sell them for, and if the revenues exceed the costs, I'm going to go ahead. I don't need to care about climate change. I just need to care about money, and I'm going to build the electric car factory because it will make me money. But that doesn't work in practice, because in practice, it's really difficult to reduce many decisions to a financial calculation. So back in 2007, Vodafone's strategy was to win spectrum license auctions in the West, because that's where there was the biggest market. M-Pesa could have never been justified with a financial spreadsheet or any calculation. But the power of purpose is it frees a company to think about value creation opportunities that ultimately end up being successful, but you could have never justified with a spreadsheet analysis to begin with. So this is why I talk about the business case of purpose, is it unleashes the possibility to develop these value creation strategies that end up being profitable, even if you could have never thought of the profit from the outset. Now, I'm nearly at the end of my time, but let me just end by saying, well, is there any evidence behind this? Because I handpicked one company, Vodafone, that succeeded in launching something purposeful and monetizing it. But you might think, well, this is just a single story. Right? How do you know that maybe in general, purpose and profit are misaligned and I've just chosen the one case that it works? So my day job as a business school professor is not to tell stories. It's not even to write case studies, but it's to analyze hundreds of companies across dozens of industries over multiple years. And I wanted to find out, are purposeful companies actually delivering higher returns? So one of my own studies looked at the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. So why did I look at this? Why was that one of my measures of purpose? It's because in nearly every organization, employees are absolutely critical. Now, climate is important, but climate matters much more in, say, energy than, say, in tech. Whereas I chose to look at employees because that's something critical in every industry. And so what I found was that companies which went over and above and beyond in how they treated their workers over a 28-year period, so this is not just a flash in the pan, over 28 years, they delivered higher returns of 2.3 to 3.8% per year, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. Now, let me just end with actually some words from the other side. So when I talk about purpose, I'm obviously very enthusiastic and positive about it, but I also would like to highlight that purpose does have some importance of restraint. So what does that mean? So what do you think about when a company is purposeful? We often think that purpose is a synonym for altruism. A purposeful company should serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, and communities and shareholders. Now that sounds great, but it's a bit unrealistic because sometimes there are trade-offs. So if I'm committed to climate change, then I might shut down polluting plants. That's good for the environment, but it's bad for workers. So if I'm going to try and be all things to all people, that is not actually something which is going to be realistic. So I define purpose as why a company exists, who it serves, its reason for being, and the role it plays in the world. And now that might seem pretty lofty, but why am I defining it this way? Because it highlights the importance of being focused and targeted. Why you exist, who you serve. It can't be to solve every single one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but to focus on the issues that you have the most expertise in addressing. So going back to Vodafone, why did it choose to address financial inclusion? Because it knew that it had the expertise in telecoms, and if they just thought a little bit more creatively, they could use that expertise to transfer not just text messages, but also money. So just to end here, when I think about the why and the who, how do we decide this? The why, I'm saying, should be driven by comparative advantage. So any CEO should ask herself, what is in my hand? So what is the unique resources? What's the unique expertise that my company has? And how can I use this to serve society if I think a bit more creatively? So with Vodafone, it was leveraging their technology to launch M-Pesa. Mercedes in the coronavirus pandemic, it was their precision engineering that they used to make some ventilators and so on. And in terms of who you serve, yes, you would like to serve every single one of all of these stakeholders. But the idea of materiality is actually there will be some that are first among equals. So there might be some companies who say, well, we are so committed to the environment that actually we will make some decisions even if they lead to redundancies because we think the climate crisis is so important. For other companies, it might be workers that are really important or communities, but to have the idea that we can't be all things to all people, we do need to sometimes make trade-offs, I think is an important part of purpose. And so there is some evidence which suggests that actually companies that do purpose in a focused, targeted way are going to be the ones which are more successful in the long term. I won't go through the study here because I'm out of time, but what I would just like to end with is saying, well, purpose is about serving society, but serving society in a targeted way. It is not a company's responsibility to solve every single one of the world's problems. Thanks so much again, Alessia, for the opportunity to talk about purpose.
Oh, it was a real pleasure. Thanks so much, Alex. It was great to have you with us. So appreciate if you need to dial off, but thank you very much for joining us. So we're going to move on now to talk about radical transparency in action. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because Alex has shared his definition of purpose, and it's very similar to ours, because we would define purpose as the definition and demonstration of impact and the value that you're creating on both. And it has to be threefold. Firstly, on stakeholders, internal and external, the business bottom line, because we want our brands to flourish, and also the impact on wider society, whether it's socially or actually on the environment. And we always say, if it doesn't do all three, then it's not necessarily purpose. But purpose in action now, and specifically radical transparency. Pete, over to you.
Thanks so much, Nalesha. And with Professor Alex's kind of inspiration in mind, we wanted to think about some really practical ways that we could go and apply this to the different brands that we work on. And I'll just go back to Nalesha's model from the beginning, which sort of explains the tightrope that we're walking, where on the one hand, customers, staff, investors have impossibly high expectations on our brands for positive impact. And on the other hand, it's going to take some time to overcome these large and complicated problems. So the only way forward, as Nicola Restrup said from Ghani, is to be honest, but not perfect, which is what we call radical transparency. And it's a really interesting moment because actually, probably for the first time, the spotlight is now shining on marketeers and advertising agencies because people are so conscious of the age of information and misinformation. So just as an example, Nalesha highlighted the oil companies that are hiring PR firms to make coal look clean. But equally, advertising agencies are standing up, such as in the initiative Clean Creatives, to say, actually, we don't want to work on this anymore, and signing pledges not to work on issues like this. So it's marketers and advertisers' time in the spotlight to focus on these issues. And with that in mind, we wanted to set the scene in terms of our practical working, and we've got some kind of ground rules for how radical transparency can be put into action. The first is that not all brands have the same starting place. So actually, a study from a Dutch agency found that local companies or companies with a local presence are much more trusted than large or national or multinational companies. And to some extent, brands who are born with a purpose are also trusted more than those that develop it later on. But actually, it's those brands with a local advantage that have a real competitive advantage. Equally, we're seeing that staff and other internal stakeholders seem to be a lot more important in radical transparency than external stakeholders like customers. And actually, it's interesting to see several brands that people perceive to be purposeful, like Brewdog or Everlane, actually being called out by their internal stakeholders, by staff, who are saying that the company isn't living up to its values or the promises that it's making. So bringing staff along the journey is really critical. Communication is key. A study we did recently with the general public in Britain found that 2 in 3 people said purposeful marketing is all starting to look the same. And obviously, as brands move towards more purposeful communications, the temptation is to leave your brand's typical personality and talk in a more earnest way. But that's leaving us with a bit of a sea of sameness. The communications, the purposeful communications on the right, we've removed the brand's logos from, and really they could be any brands, that everything is starting to look the same. So the traditional rules of creativity still apply. We still have to be interesting and different when communicating our positive impact. And we encourage brands to stick with the personality and charm that they apply to the other communications that they put out. When it comes to communicating to the public, one thing that we need to keep in mind is actually that ordinary people are really smart and they're really savvy and aware of purpose washing. 61% of people say they're aware that brands use positive impact as a way to sell more product. So that bait and switch technique won't work. We have to be genuinely creating value for people, as Professor Alex said. And it's worth noting as well that it is possible to continue to make large amounts of profit without purpose, but we think it's a high risk and unsustainable strategy for the future. But there are brands, for example, online retailer Boohoo, who had their biggest year of being called out for poor workers' rights, in the loudest possible way, being called out. But in the same year, they had a 41% increase in revenue. And we know that this is because purpose is just one of a number of factors that people consider in their brand buying behavior, which you may yourselves have found in your research because it comes up really consistently. This is just one study from Ipsos Mori that ranks people's purchasing motivations in order, and price, quality, reliability, performance, design, they all still come at the top, and purpose comes in 9th place. But it's when you're in a market where price and quality are very similar that actually purpose helps you really stand out and differentiate from competitors. So it's one of many factors at play in consumers' minds. Another recent study that we conducted with the British public actually started to segment the audience into different purposeful buying behaviors. This is a report called Purpose Personified that we published. And we found that there are different personas in the public. There are the pioneers, who are people who invest a huge amount of their own personal time in finding purposeful brands. There are rejectors who think that brands shouldn't get involved in purposeful issues. And most importantly, there's a bunch of people in the middle, the mass market, who are balancing price and quality and purpose. They'd like to have both. And we see that trend is increasingly growing, but people have different price to purpose sensitivities in their buying behavior. What we do know is that purposeful buying behavior is really strongly correlated to age. And actually, the future belongs to the younger generations who have much higher demands for purposeful brands. So Gen Z said they're 3 times more likely to say that a brand needs to have a purpose more than just making a profit. And this is part of a future-proofing strategy for most brands. It's all summed up nicely by Connie Brahms. the digital and marketing officer of Unilever, who said that purpose is one of our levers for success. It's truly an accelerator of growth, but it's not just a correlation, it's actually a causation. When you have a brilliant purpose, it inspires growth and innovation and staff engagement throughout the whole organization. Or in other words, it starts with value and a fantastic product delivering superiority of quality and best price. But if you can deliver that, then values come on top of it as an accelerator for growth. So those are the ground rules. We have now 7 principles for making radical transparency happen at your organization. And we've got case studies from brands that are doing it really brilliantly. So the first one we talked about was being proactive in your reporting of failures rather than reactive. A great example is Tony Chocolonely, a chocolate brand who stand for a new way of producing cocoa without child labour. It was a very brave move for them this year to publish that actually they found 1,700 cases of child labour in their supply chain, with cocoa being a particularly difficult supply chain to monitor. And actually, that could have been a reputationally damaging statistic, but instead they used radical transparency as a risk management strategy. They took ownership of the problem and published it themselves, and made a commitment to improve. And actually, they're one of the best brands when it comes to reducing child labour in their supply chain. So proactive reporting is a big part of what brands are doing, often as part of their journey to B Corps. And they're finding ways that they're not quite doing good enough, but they're sharing them with the public. And it's interesting, given the fact that purposeful communications all look quite similar, that there are quite interesting and fun ways to actually proactively report on your failings. So a great example is Ace and Tate, who are a glasses brand. As part of their move to B Corp, they found a number of failings, and they published it in a report which was called "We Fucked Up." A really interesting and funny way to grab people's attention, but it wasn't just apologizing for the stuff they've got wrong. They also committed to doing things differently in the future. And we love this quote from their CEO. Responses have been both positive and negative, but I sleep better at night knowing we communicate openly instead of trying to present a very shiny image. So that's principle number 1. Principle number 2 is actually, unlike other communication that tries to simplify a message, when it comes to purpose and transparency, actually the detail is really important. So a great example is Brewdog, who you may have seen called out in a recent panorama into their workings. They claim is that they're growing the biggest forest, a Brewdog forest, and every beer you buy helps grow this forest. The reality is they've spent a lot of money buying the land to grow the forest in Scotland, but actually they're relying also on a lot of taxpayers' money to plant the trees on the land that they've bought. And that is a significant detail that actually changes the story quite a lot. And being clear and honest about that detail would have been a lot better of a way forward for Brewdog. And equally, sometimes sharing the detail helps explain to people why you're not there yet. So a great example is Tala Leggings. Their CEO explained the sustainability decisions that she made to her customers when the brand was really young. She said, when we started, it quickly became apparent why everything was about £100 for a pair of sustainably produced leggings. And we found that actually, if we produced 92% sustainable leggings, we could reduce the price to £42, make them more accessible and grow the brand more. You need transparency to explain those trade-offs, because sustainability is nuanced and constantly evolving. And the customers of Tala were brought on that journey with the brand. Our third principle is to share your experiments. So along the way of creating value, you're going to try lots of different things. Some of them will work brilliantly and some of them won't. But the point is that the brand is trying. And you can bring customers, staff, and investors on the journey by celebrating those experiments. So this is an example from sustainable laundry product Ecova, who are experimenting with new lids that are 50% made of recycled rubbish. And they've shared this story, even though it's just a really early experiment with a bit of charm. Some of our caps are a bit rubbish. So bring people along board with your experiments. Clearly, in radical transparency, measurement is really important to share with people the impact that you're having or not having yet. But measurement is also notoriously difficult. So it's really important to do your best to find those measurement tools, and if not, create them where they don't exist already. So we're big fans of the Eco Score, which is a new way of measuring the carbon impact of FMCG goods. And it's been adopted by Colruyt, who are a really big supermarket in Europe, and also now Lidl in the UK, who in their supermarkets are publishing a sort of carbon rating of some of the products in their stores. And not all of the products have a good carbon rating, but it gives consumers the tools to make those decisions themselves. Our fifth principle is to clean up your portfolio, even if it means accepting a short-term cost. So Dick's is a sporting goods store in the States who sell guns, and we know that the legislation around selling guns in America is very loose, and because of that there's a problem with mass shootings. But in the wake of those, Dick's actually accepted lost profits by imposing on themselves much stricter restrictions of selling guns. It meant that they sold a lot less, and they went above and beyond the law, but it was something that they could talk to their customers about. They were cleaning up their portfolio and making sure they were doing the best they possibly could. And to Alex's point about creating value, we actually think that the biggest problem areas are the most interesting areas for innovation and growth in the future. So we think that brands should lean into the areas where they're having the most harm, and that will be the place where they'll find the most interesting new ways to create value. So a great example is Cengage, who are one of the biggest textbook producers in America. And they accepted that they were part of the problem, that education is inaccessible to people on lower incomes because textbooks are really expensive. And when they accepted they were part of the problem, they launched Cengage Unlimited, which was a new product portfolio of much cheaper, digital and more flexible educational offers, which made their products more inclusive. And similarly, Getty Images accepted their responsibility in the conversation about representation in advertising and the lack of diversity and inclusion in those images. But once they'd accepted their part of that, they then went on to commission the Show Us range of more inclusive imagery, which now leads their product portfolio. And our final principle is embracing the circular economy, which we think is the place where lots of brands will end up on this balance between high expectations and the reality. So the circular economy allows you to report on kind of innovation that is both sustainable and good for the customer. So some great examples of this are North Face Renewed, who know that the outdoor equipment is one of the biggest polluters of the landscape, but they've reduced waste by refurbishing outdoor clothing and equipment in a new renewed range. And similarly, Moss Bros, to combat fast fashion, have launched Moss Box Unlimited. Instead of selling clothes, they're hiring them out on a monthly basis. And more famously, IKEA have launched their secondhand range with circular hubs in store where people can take back or swap or trade or fix IKEA furniture, which is a big contributor to waste. And interestingly, they've seen that it's also increased footfall, and therefore they're selling more new products as well as recycling old. So those are our 7 principles: report failure proactively, be clear on the details, share your experiments, create measurement frameworks, clean up your portfolio, lean into your problem areas, and embrace the circular economy. And we have a model for doing this, which will help create value and grow the pie. And that's review, report, reinvent. So reviewing the harm that you're doing and the impact that your brand is having, report that to customers, staff, shareholders in a creative and interesting way, but then go on to reinvent the system and lean into the areas where you're having the biggest harm to do that. And of course, it's a continual cycle of improvement. And we work with brands in a number of ways to do that. So just a little bit on our good services. We do 3 things with brands. We do purpose definition, where we're helping purposeful brands tell their story. We do purposeful innovation, where we work on brands on those problem areas to come up with new products, initiatives. And we also do purposeful communication, where we're telling that story to staff or customers. So just to end, we love this quote from Ron Kaufman, who said, making an honest mistake is acceptable, but failing to fix it is not. And we think that's the heart of our story about radical transparency. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Nilesha, who's going to moderate questions.
Thanks so much. We do have a little bit of time for questions. So if you do have any burning questions or points of clarification, then do put them in the chat and I'll try and get through some. And I've also been sent some messages directly asking questions. So we've got one that is specifically around a point of detail then. And probably, Pete, you're best placed to answer this one because it was something in one of your slides. We've got it from Rowena, who says, you mentioned purpose coming in 9th place when making buying decisions. Have you seen any research around where purpose comes when choosing a new job?
That's really interesting. I know Accenture have a report on purposeful employment, but I'm not sure if there's any findings in there about a particular ranking. But that would be really interesting if we can find that.
It would, wouldn't it? Because we know certainly from the statistics that talent attraction, talent preservation is incredibly important. And this is purpose is a really big consideration for when you're looking for a new job. So there's a couple of other questions that have been sent to us. And I think that these are really important because it's about fear. Because I think because we are operating in a call out culture, there's a lot of fear. And I think it must be tremendously difficult if you are a brand marketeer wanting to do some really brave stuff, but there is definitely a prevailing fear of being called out. So the question is, does radical transparency mean I have to reveal everything about my brand? Well, I can certainly help to answer that, which is no, not at all. You don't absolutely have to do that. The most important thing is that it's aligned with your purpose and it reflects an attitude. So much of the attitude and the tone of voice that you're conveying in your communication is that which you want to try and convey in your purpose and to carry that on. It's really just about being positive, and taking a proactive stance where you can. But also, no, I don't think anyone's expecting you to be perfect. It's just about being transparent and honest when it really, really counts. I don't know, Pete, if you wanted to build on that at all before I move on to the next question.
Yeah, I would just say that, clearly we have a lot of conversations with nervous, clients who, are afraid of being called out or making a wrong move. But fundamentally, we believe that radical transparency is actually a risk management strategy. And by being honest, you're reducing the risk of being called out in the long term, as well as, creating value in different ways.
Absolutely. And there's another question about who really owns radical transparency and where the responsibility lies within an organization. I mean, we would say that actually it relies on everybody to get involved because it should really allow for all stakeholders to get involved. But it's most effective when it's obviously driven from the top down. But actually everybody who is closest to the problem that you wish to solve has a role to play. I'm just aware that there is a Q&A function also at the bottom of the screen. And so if you want to post an anonymous question, you can. I'm going to read one out that's just come in anonymously. Hi, it says, I'm curious if any panelists think Gen Z will become less interested in purpose as they age, and those key drivers like price and quality increasingly matter? That's a really good question, actually. In other words, will they become less idealistic about purpose when they are buying, for example, homes, having kids, paying for their own groceries, etc.? I'm reminded of our research, Pete, actually, so you might want to nod to that.
Yeah, well, I think how to predict the future. I think it's really interesting looking at millennials to see where we're going, because it's a direct correlation down in terms of purpose. And actually, most parents are now millennials. That is an age group that is coming into money and starting families, and they are still reinventing institutions to be more purposeful. There clearly is a balance of cost, but actually millennials have kept that purposeful buying behavior even into that kind of middle stage of life. And in the future, millennials, an amazing stat, millennials are due to inherit the biggest transfer of wealth in human history when they get older from the kind of wealthier baby baby boomer generation down. So my question is, what will that purposeful generation of millennials do when they receive that huge transfer of wealth? And I think that will be a really exciting time.
So we've got another question, which I think is quite a common question. Certainly this comes up a lot in some of the meetings that we have, which is all about ESG. So the question is radical transparency aligned with reporting and ESG? So this is a really interesting one, because I think it highlights some of the confusion, certainly when we talk to clients about purpose and the difference between CSR and ESG. ESG, we would say, is really about reporting your compliance. But within that, there's very limited opportunity to create real value and real difference. So radical transparency is all about taking a proactive stance. So it's much more than just ESG reporting and compliance and box ticking. It's about the value creation within society, for the business, for individual stakeholders. If you remember that definition I was referring to earlier, that three-part definition of what purpose is, that's where radical transparency really needs to live. Right, let's see, some more questions. So this is one for you, Pete. Does purpose come higher or lower up the list depending on the type of purchase? For example, an everyday food item versus a bigger ticket item?
It's a great question. I don't have the stats to hand, but I do know that we've been working on a purposeful building society, and actually the ranking of purposeful motivations was very similar for kind of big ticket items like mortgages, as well as this particular study, which was across the board. So I would say I expect them to be largely the same. Actually, the biggest differentiator that we found was age. And the purposeful behaviours were higher up the ranks for people who were both younger and also higher educated. And those were the two biggest correlations.
And there's another really good question that comes up a lot, which is, do you think that there is a conflict between brand, which is about perception, and impact, which is about real impact, i.e. societal impact?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question. I think that in our age where media is so saturated, actually the most interesting marketing campaigns aren't necessarily advertising. They're often new initiatives that are set up and then talked about in advertising, if that makes sense. So things like the Moss Bros hiring or the IKEA circular economy hubs, they might be talked about in advertising, but they're actually new initiatives. So I would say there's a kind of difference between new products and then the actual communication of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just seeing if there's any more. There's a really good question in the general chat. And it's interesting because I haven't seen this question for a while, because in our view, as we were saying earlier, the purpose debate we think is kind of over. And it's more about how you make it happen in a way that is radically transparent. But clearly some brands are still at a different point in the journey. And the question is, how do you engage C-suite leaders who are struggling to understand what being truly purposeful means and don't believe that this is the way forward? That's a really difficult one, isn't it? Because I think Alex has made a very passionate case for purpose, full of business evidence that over and above the sort of moral and ethical business debate. I mean, I think that the statistics and the business information out there is staggering now. It's hard to ignore, but I think you do have to think about what kind of business you are and what problem in society you can legitimately rally around and get involved in and try and fix, because I do agree that it's no point trying to do something unless it feels authentic. So really the question is, how do you do it authentically? Would you agree, Pete?
Yes, definitely. I think generally research is showing that C-suite executives are incredibly bought into purpose as a general rule of thumb. But yeah, of course, it goes back to Alex's talk about being able to grow the pie and show that purpose is genuinely creating value for the business. Essentially money talks, and that's the best way to sell it in, I think.
Money talks, absolutely. And I wonder if that is a good note on which to end this session. It's been really fantastic hearing some of your questions. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Pete. And Alex has left, but a very warm thank you to Alex. We've come to the end of our presentation, and I know that lots of questions are still coming in. So if you do want to send them to us, you can write to us at hello@goodagency.co.uk. I'm sure that it's left many of you with a lot of things to think about. This is certainly not an easy thing to fix overnight. So if you want a conversation, do reach out to us. We've taken your questions, we've opened the floor, but unfortunately we have now run out of time. A very special thank you to all of you in the audience for taking the time to attend, for asking your questions. And we know that radical transparency takes a lot of bravery. So thank you for supporting our events, because we exist for our clients, we exist for you, and I hope that what we have shared is helpful. Do watch out for some more events coming up from Good. We'll be launching a Purpose Impact series where we will be getting much more practical about the subject of purpose and how you activate it in an exciting, authentic, transparent way. And we'll be also talking to a number of guests and panelists who will be joining us. So do look out for that. There'll be more information. But until then, do look after yourself and one another. And we really look forward to seeing you next time. So thanks for joining us.